Well, what I'll talk about is something that we've been using with some of our clients, and these clients very often have collected a lot of effort data, but this data is not consistently used, and sometimes it's not used at all to facilitate their estimation process. And this is a recurring issue in software. By and large, estimation is based on experience, and as a result, know-how is not easily transferred to other people in the organization. Now, if some of that data were analyzed and put in a form that can be used by others, then at least some of the know-how that has been acquired would be available to others to apply in their projects. We develop software in our company, and it has been my experience that estimates that I received from our developers were consistently below actuals by a factor that was often unpredictable. In our case, it was software that we used internally for the provision of our own services, so we could somehow manage when the estimates were totally off track. However, for an organization that develops software for external customers, such large variations will lead to corners being cut in order to meet costs, in order to meet delivery schedules. And even though clients prefer to deal with the devil they know rather than the one they don't, there are limits to the amount of abuse that they are willing to take. And also, given that the prevalence of fixed-price contracts, estimation is often a critical factor for an organization providing software development services. Now, this is not to say that an organization has to do the work at a price corresponding to the estimates. I mean, there are business factors coming into play, and for instance, an organization doing the work at a price lower than the estimate may have a strategy to get maintenance contracts later on that will compensate for the losses that have been experienced during development. However, this decision should really be made based on an analysis of data with knowledge of the losses that will be absorbed by the organization. Now, agile methods have brought a different perspective to this situation, and I will discuss them briefly a little bit later on in the webinar. Now, every engineering discipline, other than software, has defined its measurement system. So, if we're talking about temperature, for instance, temperature is measured in Celsius degrees, in Fahrenheit degrees, in Kelvin, or in Rankine. I mean, typically there are no others. Software, on the other hand, it will be measured in bytes, it will measure in function points, it will be measured in use case points, and for function points alone, there are over 20 variants of them. So I still remember in my high school chemistry and physics classes, half my time was spent measuring. And when I moved to software, this measurement culture all but disappeared. The approach was basically cycle through code, compile it, get the list of errors, make changes until the software compiled without errors. That was basically the process that was followed, but typically no measurements were taken during executing that process. Now, the most common software measurement is effort. There may be other measurements such as cost, duration, productivity, quality, velocity, but something is needed to normalize the effort data that is collected, since it is the most common one, such that comparisons can be meaningfully established. So if we have a large project, obviously the effort will be larger. If we have a small project, the effort will be smaller. How do we compare those projects? How do we compare performance? How do we compare productivity, for instance? So this is the whole idea of measurements. Now, the problem, of course, is that size is different from effort. If I wanted to build myself a house and the contractor told me that the house that I wanted would be 50 person weeks large, that wouldn't tell me much. Typically, I would want to know, like, how much space will there be, how many square feet. So even though the size of the house is affected by the amount of labor or effort that went into building it, it's also affected by many other factors, such as the technical and management skills of the builders, the tools they use, the material that they will be using, also the area where it's going to be built. But those are factors that can be adjusted by the builders. As an analogy, if an author wants to publish a book, the types of questions that the publisher will ask him or her will consist of why does he or she want to write that book? Obviously, what's the topic of the book? Who's the competition? Were there any books published on the same topic? What's the audience? How will it be marketed? How will the author participate in publicizing that book? But one of the main questions that will be asked is how many pages will it have? And why the number of pages? It's because it determines the cost, among other things, and many other factors like who will buy a book of this size, how and where will it be sold, and how many figures will it have, because that's also a factor to be taken into account for the cost. Now, ideally, the process of estimation in any type of estimation is to determine how big, what's the size of the product that we want to develop, that we want to build, what's the effort which is derived from size, possibly applying some correction factors to take into account the complexity, the scope, the experience in the domain, who will be working on that, what are the resources, and then the cost is derived. And then a budget and a schedule are prepared, either in duration or in milestones. Now, this is independent of the approach, and the cycle can be done once if one uses a waterfall life cycle, or it can be applied several times using, at the extreme, using a method like Scrum, for instance, which basically has small iterations lasting from 2 weeks to 4 weeks. Now, I mentioned Scrum because it is not only a different method of developing software, but it's also a different method of doing business, which typically doesn't rely on fixed price contracts. So the risk is reduced for the customer and also for the supplier. But as I mentioned earlier, I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Now, many organizations are good or relatively good at estimating effort, even though they don't necessarily use that collected effort data for estimating